All right, welcome back. We are now chatting about all things fantasy, the craft of creating these magical worlds, these sci-fi universes, these demonic underworlds, frankly, some of you. So I'm delighted to have with me Nazneen, Zohra, and Sarwat. And actually, do you guys have mics? Yes, you do. I'm going to ask you all to introduce yourselves. So maybe Sarwat, if you kick us off.
Hello, my
Mike.
name's...
Mike.
Sorry. Sorry. Hello. My name's Sarwat Chadda. I've been published about 15, 16 years now. I've written a multitude of books, but the ones I'm really most excited about is the Ash Mystery trilogy, which is an Indian-inspired children's fantasy. There was the City of the Plague God, which was Mystic Protagonist, which I wrote for the Rick Riordan Presents imprint, and I've got a new duology coming out with Simon Schuster called Storm Singer, which is a combination of Indian myth and the Arabian Nights.
Amazing. Hi, I'm Zohra Nabi. I'm relatively new. I'm the author of the middle grade fantasy duology, The Kingdom Over the Sea and The City Beyond the Stars. And I'm bringing out a new historical fantasy next year, which I don't. We haven't announced it, so I don't think I'm allowed to talk about it. But I've kind of pitched it as like Dickensian stuff for kids with monsters. So that's what's coming next with me.
Exciting. Hi, I'm Nazneen Ahmed Pathak, and I am the author of City of Stolen Magic, which came out last year, and it's a historical fantasy. So it's sort of between these two panels, really. It is telling the story of British colonialism. It's the lead up to 1857, but with magic. So, and I am currently working on the second in the duology, which is called Rise of the Rebel Queens. And it's going to be about Lakshmi Bai and Hazrat Mahal, who are both queens who were actually involved in the uprising against the British in 1857, but whose stories have not really been told. So they are kind of coming into the world of City of Stolen Magic.
I didn't know that.
So exciting.
That's thrilling.
We want to read that right now, basically.
I don't want to read that.
Okay, fine. We'll do a book swap afterwards of our draft. Which authors and books inspired you to in your work?
It's really embarrassing, right? Gary Gygax, because he created Dungeons and Dragons.
Amazing.
So basically, that's because I was listening to the previous one. How do you get into writing?
Yeah.
I got into writing by playing Dungeons and Dragons. And the only reason I became a writer is because you can't actually make a career out of Dungeons and Dragons. You couldn't back then. You can now, but there was no such thing as a professional games master back in 2008. So I just think, I'm still waiting for Critical Role to give me that call. So sorry, I need you. So yeah, a friend of my sister's who was in publishing said, "Sorry, you're wasting all this time writing all these adventures. Have you ever had to go writing a novel?" I said, "No." So I might now, and that led to my first book. So Gary Gygax inspired me to become a writer.
Good on him.
Yeah.
You know,
Player's Handbook, first edition, proper old school.
Choose your own adventure books. You should be doing one of those as well. They are so popular.
Yeah.
Like roll a dice,
Yeah.
roll a dice, meet a goblin, that kind of thing.
Fair enough. I'll mention that to my agent tomorrow. Okay.
There you
Fantastic.
Cool.
Zohra, what kicked you off?
Well, I think like basically two kinds of book. The first was the kind of warm, funny, lyrical fantasy of authors like Diana Wynne Jones and Joan Aiken and Susan Cooper, all women. I really didn't read men as a child. I was kind of an anti-men reader. But so those writers who I still think are fantastic and still so readable as an adult. And the second kind was about kind of plucky young orphans working their way into people's hearts. So massive Anne of Green Gables fan, all of that kind of American sentimental fiction, massive like Noel Streatfeild fan, whose books are actually gritty and deep, and they're about children having to work from a young age and not having parents around. So those were my two kind of real inspirations, and I think if you read my books, you can probably tell that those are my two inspirations.
There are very strong strains.
Very strong strains going all the way through.
I think it's difficult for me because I'm such a bookworm and have been since I was really, really young. I think what I used to do was read books and then reinvent them in my head. So I really, really loved The Secret Garden and A Little Princess. But for me, I imagined that the girls in those books were actually South Asian. So they both of them come over from colonial India to Britain, and when they first arrive, they find Britain cold, they find it really dismal, they don't feel at home, and it completely felt like how I used to feel when I'd come back from seeing my family in Bangladesh, and the culture shock I'd feel when I'd come back and it was raining and Heathrow Airport and so on. So I kind of did that, and when rereading them as an adult and realizing they're like key imperial colonial texts and that actually they are quite problematic in many, many ways, it was like quite an eye-opener, and thinking, oh, actually they weren't brown, and actually they were ruling brown people, and right, okay. But it was really because growing up in the 80s, we had so few books that would kind of have that mirror for South Asian children. So, and that's kind of why I wanted to write the book that I did, was because I felt like I wanted my son to have a book that he wouldn't have to do that imaginary work to fit himself into a story.
Thank you. I didn't realize there were other people who thought Mary Lennox was Indian. I thought she was from there as well. So, how much in writing all your books and your series do you draw from your own cultures and from your own perspectives and from your lived lives, and how much of it is made up? Because I think it really strongly weaves itself through all of your stories, really.
I basically write whatever I feel angriest about at that moment. And so Ash Mystery is my deep, deep hatred of Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom. Right? Oh, come on. Do you remember that whole, yeah. So do you remember that whole monkey brains thing? Yeah. So I thought, flipping heck, if I ever become a writer, I'm going to have an evil Western archaeologist sucking the life force out of India, and the hero's going to be a thuggy assassin. Yeah. And that's what I did. And so Ash Mystery is my anti-Indiana Jones. Then the City of the Plague God was right after Trump got elected. Right, hopefully the first and only time. And so then you saw all the rising Islamophobia, and all of that. So City of the Plague God was about Islamophobia. Sequel ended up being about colonialism because of that classic joke. Why aren't the what was it about the pyramids? Why are the pyramids in Egypt? Because they're too big for the British to steal.
Very good.
So, and you can get a whole novel out of that joke, which is what I did. Right? And so there's a scene in Rise of the Dragon Goddess where everybody rampages through the British Museum, nicking back their stuff. And it was like, yeah. And then with Storm Singer, it's post-COVID, and the outrage of, sorry, I just sound like such a socialist. That's because I am.
I should end the room with a bit of Marxism.
Yeah, and you saw how all the billionaires have just become so much richer. So I thought, I want to write a story about the 1%ers. And so, in Indian mythology, you have the Garuda. So I thought, what if there was an entire society of Garudas? So these are the flying humans that live in a city in the clouds above everybody else, right? And so they hold on to the rain. So all the mortals are living on a parched desert landscape while the 1%ers hold everything. And that, I think, is the bigger thing about fantasy, which we might get onto later. And so that is Storm Singer, which comes out next year. And Crow's Revenge is really about what's happening in Palestine. So you write what consumes you, and fantasy allows you to write the big picture, or certainly for me, allows you to write the big picture.
That is wish fulfillment at its best. I love that.
I love that. I love that. That's what you bring.
Anger.
Yeah.
And revenge.
Strapline coming soon.
I guess because I was writing second world fantasy, I didn't want to make an exact replication of Kashmiri culture in my book. I didn't want, you know, my second world just to be fantasy Kashmir, mainly because no one's lived there since my grandparents' generation, and I didn't feel qualified to do it. I'm not someone who's lived there and worked there, which is what I think you need to do to have, even to have someone like visiting a second world fantasy, you need to have that level of, I don't know, or I didn't, maybe you don't need to, but I felt like I couldn't do it. I think what I wanted to bring, I guess what is culture from my own experiences with my family is maybe the kind of dynamics that occur when you've had immigration and displacement and kind of and people not talking about that and what's said and what's unsaid, and being in the position of being a child trying to sort of work backwards and work out what's happened and work out why it's made you the way you are and why things are the way they are. And I think when I started writing Kingdom, it was the pandemic. And I think maybe it was just all of us being inside. At the time I lived not only with my parents, but my grandparents as well. I think all of us, it was a 7-person household, all of us being inside together. My grandparents suddenly started talking about the war in Kashmir, which they'd never done before. And my dad maybe started talking a bit more about like what his experience had been like growing up here. And I think that was what I wanted to bring to the novel, was that experience of like generations and like how you work backwards and how you confront your heritage.
Oh, that's so interesting. I assumed the protagonist was based on you, but it's based on your dad.
Oh, I've never had that reading before. I always say my protagonist is based on my sisters.
Oh.
But maybe, you know what, that's a revelation.
So yeah, there's a lot that went into City of Stolen Magic in terms of stuff that I've lived through, but I think, as I was saying before, like the motivation for writing it was really when I had my son, Roshan, and I'm married to a Hindu from Mumbai, and Roshan's kind of heritage is basically connected to like Dhaka, to Mumbai, to London and Southampton, and all of those are like major port cities. And it really struck me that like actually, you know what, there would be no Roshan without colonialism that created the migration that resulted in his grandparents coming to England. And I'd been working on various projects as a historian, looking at the history of migration to London and thinking about the histories of the Lashkars and the Ayers, and specifically in Victorian London. And I'd been working in Tower Hamlets, and I'm British Bangladeshi, and I had never realised until I was 32 that there had been South Asians from Bengal who were working on the P&O and the Merchant Navy ships coming into the Port of London and docking in East India Dock, and therefore that's why they've just set up lodging houses, because sailors, Lashkar sailors couldn't actually stay in white lodging houses. They usually had food being served downstairs and people would sleep upstairs, and those were the first Bengali restaurants in East London. And then you have the kind of that becoming Bangla Town. And I'd never known that when I was a child. And it goes back to that kind of idea of history that we are not taught. And it means that there is some kind of disconnect in our identities as kind of second and third and fourth generation South Asian children in Britain. And so there's that. And then the other thing I wanted to bring in was when I used to go to Bangladesh and to my grandfather's village, my father's father, my dada, and there were, I would feel like magic was real, like, because I was told you can't sit under that tree, there's a bhoot in that tree, you can't do this because you'll get the evil eye, and we're going to wear tabis to protect us, and all these elements of kind of folklore, but it was kind of real. It wasn't someone was told by a jinn that they were that their goats were drowning in the river in the middle of the night, and he went there and he was just rescued by someone walking past, and his goats were nowhere. It was real. When I came back to England, and I would love lots of magical books and stuff, but it was all pointy hats and wands, and I love pointy hats and wands. I love Diana Wynne Jones, but I couldn't see that magic anywhere. So when I started writing this book for Roshan, I wanted that in there as well. So I was like, I don't want to be history and I don't want to be, I want to do both. And I want to create all this stuff in here. And that's why it's such a crazy book.
I think there are two fascinating points there. One, which is that Jinn and South Asian mythology gods are a lot harder to get your head around than the traditional English folkloric fantasy, I guess. And I did want to ask you all about how you create your gods and your fantasy creatures and everything. But also, I'm fascinated by the notion that both of you, well, actually all three of you, are looking at history through the eyes of fantasy. And I wonder if it's an easier medium with which to explore this than actually the traditional history that we were talking about a little bit earlier. So that's two questions for the price of one. But
Two questions.
Yeah, really. Do you want to give?
No, let's start with you.
Yeah.
Okay, all right.
So you're going to have time to think
Time to
about
ruminate
it.
on
Right,
this.
thanks a lot. Right, hang on.
Okay, fantasy and history.
Fantasy and history. Well,
Why one of why?
yes.
Why both?
Yes, I think it is the realm of the possible. I think it is where we can do that wish fulfillment work, and I get my magical children to try and bring down the British Empire. We know that people tried; they did not necessarily succeed very quickly. So yes, I think I wanted a space where I could deal with the actual history, but I could have the freedom to give my characters more agency, give them a chance to fight back, and give them a chance to resist in a way that that British colonialism was so brutal that they, any of those attempts were really stamped out in such a horrific way. So I didn't think I could tell that story in that way for children without extra trauma. And fantasy gives me that space to give that agency and sense of possibility and hope, and then we kind of historical novels, like you said, like everyone's talking about earlier, are not really about then, they're about now. So I felt like it enabled me to keep swiveling and pivoting between the two, and thinking about Roshan was really useful in thinking I'm telling this story for him and his time now, and I need this story to be able to help him navigate everything that's going on, and even more so now.
So Amin Lakshmi Bai with the flaming sword is the wish fulfillment that we need, really.
Yeah, definitely.
Zohra, for the upcoming one that you're not allowed to talk about.
I think I can do it a little bit with King.
Go on, be vague.
And then I'll start with the novels I've actually written that people can buy now.
That's on the table at the back of the shop, you mean?
What was the question again?
Fantasy and history.
Yeah, so I think maybe there was because like the history that really inspired the fantasy worlds of the Kingdom of the Sea and City on the Stars was the kind of golden age of the Islamic world that I've always been so interested in, and I've loved so much, and I've always just thought was so interesting, and I want people, physically want people to know about and read about and be as interested in it as I am. And I think there were ways of kind of smuggling in my favorite stuff about that period, like the fact, like the kind of rows of bookshops and the universities and the libraries, and to having the magics in my books. So the first one, the magic is very much in verse, and this is like the elevated form of magic. It's become a kind of elite thing. It's about like sort of constructing verse, constructing poems, and sort of because of the importance of poetry and all the texts I was reading and all the stuff I was learning about, and it's the way that even the world is set out. The fact that like my publishers kept asking me like, what is the country? And I was like, no, it's not a country. It's a city, and it's got provinces around it, but the city's where everything's happening. So just stuff like that. It felt like I was like smuggling in history by having spells and magic and sort of high stakes epic action. And with the book I'm not allowed to talk about, I think I haven't written pure historical fiction, so I don't want to say things that aren't true. But maybe there's a tendency towards more nuance because you're writing very realistic, like about real people and about real events. There's a sort of pressure to be more ambivalent and more, well, there are both sides here. And I think writing fantasy kind of gives you the permission to turn it into an epic story of good and evil, which I think is what a lot of us see it as. Like, most people aren't both citing it, or you didn't grow up with your families both citing it. You grew up with no, they were the evil oppressors who came and took the land and drove us out. And,
but they gave us trains.
Oh, they gave us the railways. No one has sat down with their dad at dinner. The dad's been like, you know what? But they did give us railways, so maybe it wasn't all. We don't want to both sides it. We want our stories to feel as epic and sweeping as the kind of like the way that Lord of the Rings did. We can have this kind of epic evil and it be colonialism, or it be capitalism, or it could be colonial capitalism. And I think it gives us permission to do that.
Right, that's so fascinating. So is the magic in your stories like through poetry?
Yeah, and then the second one is like storytelling magic, which
that's so cool.
So
right, because that's what Storm Singer. She literally has to sing to charm all the different elements to do what she's doing. That's like the hard stuff. The whole thing.
As well.
Crossover universe.
Right, but actually more recently I've been writing probably more high fantasy, so it's actually quite disconnected from the real world. And so, but I mean, at the end of the day, it's all inspired by the real world. Like Tolkien, he took everything from the Anglo-Saxons and so really I thought, it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. Which is why Storm Singer, which comes out next April, is an amalgam of the Garuda mythology, an Indian setting, but then also a lot of the stuff from the Arabian Nights. But the rocks, the giant winged birds, from it. I thought, wouldn't it be cool if there were tribes that rode them? And so I thought, I'm just going to put that. Sometimes more is more. And that's the thing about fantasy, isn't it? I think, flipping heck, I'm going to put that in as well. There's a moderation. So, but there was an interesting cultural issue because I actually wanted my protagonist, Nargis, to have an Indian heritage, a fancy Indian heritage. So she will use Indian phrases, while the rock riders are of Arabic background, an Arabesque background. And so what's brilliant was actually being allowed to meld those things, and actually the craft is making it seem culturally distinct in a fancy world, so it still feels quite separate. So the rock riders will say salam, she'll say namaste, little things, but do actually make them, because they're attached to the real world, they do make them quite separate. So there's elements that even in high fantasy inevitably go back to the world we live in.
Amazing, thank you. It leads me on to my next question quite nicely, which is, so therefore, when you're creating these monsters, you're creating these mythologies, and we're coming away from the Brits, how do you craft your magic? How do you craft your worlds? Is it binders of things? Are you drawing the maps? Are you looking towards the mythology, or are you creating your own things? Do you make the jinn far more evil and sinister than they are in our backyards? Tell me about how you make a magic world, please.
I use poetry. So the whole thing is with Storm Singer is, because of my Dungeons & Dragons background, I really want the magic to be cohesive, because otherwise it becomes too easy, or just cast any spell to get out of it. So with Narga, she has to charm the elemental spirit, whether it be fire, Ifrit or Makars with the fire, water, earth, etc. But each spirit has its own temperament. So the fire spirits are really overactive and really ridiculously excitable. The golems, because they're earth and stone, really slow. They take ages to respond, etc. And so that was really the great fun of wanting to create a unique magic system that was absolutely ingrained in the world. And it's called Storm Singer because the whole thing is you've got the typical elemental spirits and the lesser ones, but then you have the great elemental spirits, and one of them is monsoon. And the whole story is the idea that Garuda's destroyed monsoon hundreds upon hundreds of years ago, which is why it's never rained. But she might know the song to bring her back. So the hits in the title.
I think for me it's just loads and loads of historical research, because that's what I love. And I think to kind of create a whole kind of craft and a whole world and culture and all these kind of things, you need to be really immersed in it, and for it to come from a kind of deep sort of, you have to be like determined. You have to like really want to get it all on the page. So I think it has to be like creating magic has to be a reflection of something you're a bit interested in or obsessed with or something. I think I filled a notebook for the very first time writing Kingdom Over the Sea and City from the Stars, because there was just so much that I had to get out and so much detail, and I loved reading for it so much. I suppose it was the first time I really engaged with some of like the lesser known stories of the 1001 Nights, or like this collection called Tales of the Marvelous and News of the Strange. It's mad. It's kind of, some of it's fragments, some of it is just like found in a library somewhere, and it's bonkers and brilliant. And engaging with those and thinking about those and thinking about how I wanted to replicate those in my book was really interesting and really like I think a really good thing for me to do. And then it's also quite interesting because obviously everything I was accessing to kind of build my magical world was translated into English. I was reading it in English. And I think definitely there's a kind of Orientalist imagination that comes into play when you're doing that and you're interpreting those works. And undoing that is just such hard work. And I'm not
thesis, Zohra.
I'm not using. I've already got one. I'm not sure that like. I'm not sure I do it. Like, am I completely successful? I don't know, because like can you be completely successful when your own, like, you know, when these stories and when these worlds and ideas are being handed down to you through white English translators? Yeah.
When you think of the Arabian Nights, you are just thinking of Dulag and you're thinking of all the Victorians.
Yes. And kind of the Scheherazade books that they're in Sikorsky piece. Yeah. Like, I was listening to that and I was like, why am I listening to that? This is a Russian translation of Kaya. Yeah. Like, you know, how do you do it? I don't know. I don't think there's an answer. But I don't think that should stop us engaging with these texts. This is our, you know, if you were part of, you know, we like the Islamic world, that era of storytelling spans such a large space. These are our stories. These are the stories that come from places like India and China, as well as like from across the Middle East. Like we shouldn't engage with them just because we have to grapple with a white translator getting stuff wrong.
And also the romance of the stories come to you as a young person. That's fine. And it's like how we were talking about Romeo and Juliet earlier. We know it from Shakespeare, but that doesn't mean you can't go back to its origins and then unpick its roots.
Yeah.
Well done.
Yeah.
Nazneen?
I think on one level, the world building was really easy for me, and the other way it was really, really difficult. So I think I am really fascinated by objects and things, and I went to an exhibition at the Ashmolean Museum quite a few years ago now, which was all about Islamic amulets, and it reminded me of like traditions of wearing taviz that my own family had in the kind of 80s and early 90s in like, the village, particularly where my father grew up. And this notion of kind of the power of the word, because the word can protect, is key to Islam, was something that I really found, like as a writer, quite magical in its own way. And so taviz were there in my mind. In this exhibition, there was this incredible shirt made of paper that had been worn by kings going into battle, and it had the whole Quran written on it. And, you know, we can say a lot about that theologically, and we can also say a lot about that in terms of it being an object and the significance and the care with which they'd written all this calligraphy on this beautiful piece of work. So those objects stayed with me a lot, and actually used them in my school visits quite a lot as well. And then there was another object, the final object of the three that kind of really stayed with me is, I don't know if you have ever seen it, but Tipu Sultan owned a hexagonal kind of die. It was made from gold. It was it's empty and hinged, and it has kind of Arabic numerals on it. And it came up for sale at auction at Christie's years ago, and it was just described as a magical box. And It was looted from Tipu Sultan after he was murdered by the British on the battlefield after fighting them, as were all of his many possessions from his palace. That's why we have Tipu's tiger in the V&A, and many of his daggers and many of the things that, like, he's got these really cool daggers which are shaped like tiger's claws because he was so, and he loved tigers so much. So he was so edge. But it's described as a magical box, but there is nothing that comes with it in terms of what it does, how it works. And one of the things I do in schools is I will go, what do you think this is? What do you think it does? And then all kinds of theories come out, and I love talking to children and seeing their imaginations go wild. And then I tell them, we don't know, because this was just ripped from Tipu Sultan's body, and because no one bothered to kind of collect the story that went along with it. So those objects kind of really helped me build the magic in City of Stone and Magic, which is both about kind of power and it's about democracy and literacy as well. So one is a written magic, which is all about the power of the word and how everyone can use the word to kind of help them help each other and help lift yourself. And the other is a kind of magic that some people are only born with, and therefore it's kind of this elite magic. And I also was kind of writing against Harry Potter and the unfairness of the fact that there are magical words where not everyone gets to be magic. And it's like, how much does that suck? You know, if you are a young child and you end up being a muggle, it's not. How can you build a magical world that's a socially just form if only some people get to have magic?
Magic, but only for private school kids.
Yeah.
It's a class thing.
It just didn't make any sense to me. So I needed to have a magic that everybody could learn, but it had to be quite difficult as well. So yeah.
No, I love the democracy in your society and the way the magic is formed, even if your main character hates learning it.
It's just really hard.
Yeah. I'm going to come to you guys for questions in a bit, so have a think. But I have one more question on my board, actually, so I'm going to prioritize myself.
Thank you very much.
Which is about language, actually, and words. And were you guys, I find it quite interesting. I love magic books. I'm a proper fantasy geek. And did you ever find any editorial input in this, or did you have any feelings about writing quite foreign worlds in your magic books? And did you ever feel like you had to put a glossary in, explain all the hundreds of different terms? You don't have that so much in Middle Earth. You just roll with whatever Silmarillion, weird Cinderin terms you're being given. Did you find it was a different experience publishing your fantasy books, or did you not have that much issue with it?
Okay. So Roshan, my kids are in a multilingual household of Gujarati, Bengali, Hindi, and English. Like those are the languages they are kind of surrounded by. They speak only English, really, but those are the languages that I can speak and understand. So and I wanted this to be a multilingual world, like, because on ships in that kind of world, if the Victorian England and India, people would have been speaking multiple languages, and on ships, especially if you've read Amitav Ghosh's, Sea of Poppies, the kind of multilingual kind of basic version of Hindustani that he has in there, that hybrid kind of form it's just how people would have had to get on, and on these ships where you have multi-ethnic crews and you all had to kind of pull in one direction. So I really wanted to represent that in my books. I mean, there's a quote from about 1930 Southampton where you go down to the docks from a book of the time, where they said you would just hear Norwegian, Japanese, and this and that, and it would just be this kind of polyglot space. And I really wanted to represent that in my book. I didn't want it to be just kind of one thing. So I kind of gave, like, there are lots of kind of little ares and babres, and my son is really embraced, Roshan's really embraced babre. He loves babre as much as Chompa loves babre and Lisa loves babre. And so and kind of all of those kind of words, but I also didn't want a glossary. I didn't want to think of my reader as being a default English white child, and it was really interesting. I heard from Shana Jackson in the other conference that is happening at the same time, the other place. It's Jonathan, that's a Jonathan Stroud reference. But yeah, she was talking about how much flack she got for saying that readers are white default in children's books. But they are, because only brown kids and black kids get their skin color described in most books. Then everybody else just gets to be, and then suddenly a brown kid walks in a room and toffee colored skin and so on and like. So I didn't want a glossary because I didn't want my Asian kids to feel like, oh look, they're explaining the whole world for the default reader and it's not us. What I then did though was flip it so that Lisa is the one who has the glossary in City of Stone and Magic, and it's the glossary because she's learning English and she has to kind of make sense of English as a language, and she's kind of saying, oh, this word in English is the equivalent of this that I know in Bengali. And so that was kind of how I achieved it, but it took me ages to work out how I was going to do it. And part of it was like, maybe I just leave it, maybe I don't do it. And none of the words are italicized because I definitely didn't want that as a visual kind of foreignness in my book.
Which I really appreciated because I can't read the word Salvar in italics anymore. Zohra?
So because, again, second world fantasy, I didn't want to just drop random Arabic words in there just because it's, it's being marketed as a Middle Eastern fantasy. I think basically Yara switches to her language.
Is that my alarm? Do you want to switch it?
No, it's my alarm actually. Let's go to the audience.
Yara switches to her language once she gets there, and she and then we just talk like that for the rest of the book. And we don't really talk about it. I think occasionally Yara reflects on how different it is just speaking with her mum versus now she's using it in kind of the communities and with other people who aren't directly related to her, and how that's changed, and how she struggles reading because she's never really had to read apart from reading her mum's shopping lists or whatever. So there's stuff like that about language in the book. I don't think I've ever really had to translate in that way for my editors. So I have I have 3 editors on this. I had 4 editors on this book.
What did you do to them? Sorry.
They've dropped off one by one. No, I had 4 editors on Kingdom and City, and 2 of them were South Asian. So it was a dream. There was stuff I didn't have to explain. I mean, there were still questions. I remember, I love my white editors. I love working with them. They're amazing. There's, a question, quite a natural question probably, which was, is it realistic that she never would have pressed her mum about the story of them coming to England? Yeah, it is. And also, literally that evening when I got that note, my great uncle came out with the story of how he'd come to England for the first time. We discovered a lot of things about him that his son was hearing for the first time as well. So I was like, yeah, realistic. Or sometimes I think when it was being copy edited, some people had queries about language. I remember hayloft. Someone was like, does this belong in this book? And I was like, yeah, it does, definitely. So stuff like that. But I think that's natural, and people have questions, and if they ask them politely and and in a sensitive way, of course, ask away. Great, I'll answer. I think it's
Thank you. Sarwat, I want to come to you, but I am just going to see. Raise your hands if you have a question. Okay. So Sarwat, you get to answer 2 questions in one go.
Okay. Oh, right, quickly about language.
Yeah, go on. Okay.
Actually, I think that's really important because when I was asked to do Join Rick Riordan Presents,
yes,
I very consciously wanted to do a Muslim protagonist. While most of the other Rick Riordan Presents have all typically been mythologies, I thought actually I'm going to pick this, mainly because I wanted to be provocative over language. No, that was not mainly, that was a strong part of it, because I wanted words like jihad, Allah Akbar, Alhamdulillah, to become mundane, right? Not to be trigger words, because I actually am quite conscious, because I primarily get published in the US. My reader is a 10-year-old white Texan boy, right? And I wanted to approach him with a dialogue that he might have been brought up to feel, oh my God, I'm going to step away from that. Jihad, the guy must be a terrorist, right? And I thought, no, I'm going to bring this into the book in a way that's low-key, normal, and not make it an untrigger word, if that's a real word.
Yeah.
Well, anyway, it is now.
Normalise it.
So there was a real quite significant point to that. That's where I wanted it.
Oh, I love that. Both of you are writing for totally different audiences.
Yeah.
They're amazing, but doing interesting things in
Yeah.
language. Crystal?
We have to be out.
Sorry.
It'll be super
No.
quick.
Okay, further questions at the top? Okay, sorry. I'm sorry. Okay,
Sorry.
I'm sorry. But that was a really interesting point to end on. So thank you. I feel like these are conversations we can just keep having. So please, let's keep having it. Please put your hands together for my panel.